Hello everybody, and thank you for tuning in to the Liberty Report. With us today is Daniel McAdams, our co-host. Daniel, good to see you.
Welcome back, Dr. Paul.
It is good to be back, but we had a sad week last week with the loss of my daughter. And I want to thank our viewers. Many of them, they're very, very generous in sending notes and flowers and all these kind of things.
Hundreds.
And you were generous with your time. And I understand that you really did great. You got a good plus. But no, it was a sad week. But
tough time.
I had been reminded by my wife that no matter how sad I get, that life will go on. And that we do know. But I appreciate all the support we've gotten. But guess what? We're back to where we left off.
Trying to save the world.
A little change in tune, little things changing, but there's still the consequences of COVID.
Yeah.
It's getting more ornery right now. We're going to talk a little bit about how they're making money off COVID. Did you ever imagine anything like that? And they're still talking about passports, and there's still a serious attack on our civil liberties.
Yeah.
So in many ways, things haven't gotten better. But there is one irony we want to talk a little bit about. The attitude toward testing has changed. CDC, all of a sudden, are suggesting that maybe the tests weren't all that accurate, and that they had to change it. But it turns out if you change what they want, they actually have a greater chance of getting reimbursements or have their way. Yeah. You know, originally we argued the case that the special tests were deeply flawed, and the more cases they had, the more money they got, and the numbers skyrocketed, and the numbers were never trustworthy. That's one thing that I sense at the articles now is people are more or less conceding that the numbers have been fake, and there's not much you can depend on. But there was one report on the CDC this time, is that they said that it's better not to overcount. You get too many false positives. Oh, lo and behold, my goodness! After about 18 months of this, they decided that. But it turns out that the purpose here is before, the more cases they had, that's when they would run it up over 40 times. Yeah. You know, anything over 28 or so, you get too many false positives. So they would do that, and then they had more cases, and then they could pump up the fear and justify. I think it's justifying the lockdown was one of their goals at that particular time. But now they're in the business of selling people on vaccines. But some people don't even want vaccines. Some people in the military don't want it. These brave soldiers, they don't want this vaccine. And it is growing. You see stories and pictures of vaccines just sitting and wasting away because, maybe we'll send them to third world countries. And if there's a problem with them, we'll send them to third world countries. And I'd tell Bill Gates to distribute them, you know, because they'd have more questions about him. If he was distributing, they might raise some questions. But their purpose was actually to show that the vaccinations are really working. And now they do the testing. Then they show, well, there's been the results, the vaccines are doing it, and everything is better. So when they want a high number, they get it. When they want a low number, then they say, well, the vaccines are great, they're working. So I think the bottom line of this is, I was just mentioning to you a little while ago, the confusion. So many statistics, and I don't want to overdo statistics, but the big thing are the big points, you know, on, is testing trustworthy? Are masks beneficial? Is a passport a good idea? And when you narrow that down and simplify it and take away the emotions and profits, you know, if we could eliminate the emotionalism and the profiteering of this, we might get to the bottom of it. And I would predict that what's gone on with the way this virus has been handled and this epidemic has been handled probably has been the most misleading of any epidemic in the history of the world.
Yeah.
And right now, people are torn, even though I'm sure you've noticed there's a lot more people shifting in our directions, and people are getting together. Enough is enough, and some of them are even standing up to the city councils in different places. So it may be that they're taking time, but I've always argued that the people have to wake up and tell the politicians what they want and what they understand is the only way it's going to happen. I think it's in a way a positive trait that if people hear something and it's crazy, to study it, be patient, maybe it'll change and this sort of thing. But there's a limit to that, and I think that's what the American people have gotten to. They've gotten to the limit of listening to all this, and they are not sold on the vaccine, and the statistics are starting to show it. And CDC, I think they're getting a bad reputation, and Fauci's probably not nearly as popular as he used to be. So I think there's a good thing there, but it's also a bad thing. The recognition that government should be involved still involves more than half the American people, and saying, well, if I need a passport, give me a passport. I want to go to work and I want to go to the ball game, and that will allow me to do it. That is a serious problem.
It is. And you mentioned, I have the sense too that the tide is slowly turning a little bit in our direction. I think a lot of that, despite all of our criticism, I think it was still warranted. The fact that Abbott withdrew the mask mandate and the restrictions when he did, that helped our side of the cause tremendously. So we have to give him some credit also. Let's not forget Florida. But what we're talking here today, and we can put up that first clip because we first heard about this. We saw Alex Berenson, we'll talk about him in a few minutes, posted about it. But Dan Horowitz has done a great job at The Blaze talking about the overreaction to a serious public health threat, no question about it. But what happened over the weekend is very interesting. And let's do a little bit of backtracking because the New York Times ran an article that we've discussed on this show several times back in August, saying that as many as 90% of the positive test results may be false positives because the PCR tests, the cycles of amplification were being run too high, 40s and 45 cycles. And as you said, they say anything over high 20s could very well be a false positive. Well, for regular people getting their tests, the CDC has refused to issue guidelines saying, hey, dial those down, you're getting false positives. But what happened over the weekend, a document was released, COVID-19 vaccine breakthrough case investigation. And what it was, it's a study of so-called breakthrough cases. I don't have to tell you this, you know already, but these are people who got COVID despite having been vaccinated. And here's what jumped out to Alex Berenson, and he tweeted about it. We'll put that tweet up in just a second. This is a statement from the CDC. Clinical specimens for sequencing should have an RT-PCR count value of less than 28. What that means in English is that if we're testing these people who have been vaccinated, don't put it up yet, please. If we're testing these people that have been vaccinated, we need to dial down the counts before we determine whether or not they actually got COVID despite being vaccinated. That makes sense, right? That makes sense. You don't want false positives because that would undermine confidence in the vaccine. Again, not criticizing them. And let's put up that tweet because this is what Berenson's reaction was to it. Wow. CDC only wants to examine post-vaccine infections with a PCR threshold of 28 or under. That standard ignores 90+% of COVID infections. The entire epidemic would have looked very different if it had been used. That is critical. This entire last year, if they had applied that same standard to general testing that they are now demanding be applied to post-vaccine testing, we would not have had probably any of the lockdowns, the shutdowns, unemployment, suicides, depressions, drug abuse that we had over the past year.
And because they still concoct cases, they still want the justification and the emergency need for everybody to get their vaccination. And yet, there are statistics now to refute what they're saying about the vaccination. 60%, some people say, of the new cases came from people who were vaccinated.
Yeah.
And that means, the vaccination isn't even worthwhile if you're going to look at it that way. But that what they do, though, is the authorities who have to keep it going, they'll say, oh yeah, there's 60% of the people, there's a lot of new cases, but it's because they don't get enough vaccination.
Yeah.
Maybe they need their second vaccination or whatever, but they have a goal in mind which is completely different than public health, because there's too many special interests, and the whole thing is they preach this one thing, we only follow science. And that is a bunch of baloney.
Yeah.
They do not follow science.
Politics.
And when we come across some scientists, and there are a lot more than are out there. We find them by the dozens, but they're out there by the hundreds now of people in the scientific field and in investigation and in the medical field that aren't convinced this thing was worthwhile, and the evidence is there. But it's better, it's better late than never.
Yeah.
But as you point out, it's starting to break through. But when are they going to crack it and say, look, enough is enough? And I guess the most astounding thing, because if our theory and thesis is correct, that there's a lot of fudging going on and exaggerations and all, and a lot of this was rigged, how were they able to manage this worldwide?
Yeah.
That still is pretty amazing that they could do that. And they said, well, there's the virus did that. But now the evidence is showing up, the virus really didn't do all this. It was the lockdown. It was the concerted effort by politicians and governments and corporations getting together and putting this program together. And unfortunately, a lot of people, you already mentioned how many people do suffer from that, because there is no doubt in my mind, more people suffered more and loss of life occurred with the lockdown than by getting the virus. If you take the ones where we practice bad medicine with our nursing homes, what is it? Some people argue it's over 95% of chances of people, having a serious illness with it. And yet they keep pounding away. This is serious business for them, and I mean business.
Business, yeah. Well, here's something that our friend Bob Wenzel put up on Target Liberty. And this is an additional, this is from the CDC, this is a quote from the CDC talking about this study of the vaccine breakthrough cases, people who get COVID despite being vaccinated. And here's another interesting bit. This is from the CDC, quote, in the coming weeks, CDC will transition from monitoring all reported vaccine breakthrough cases to focus on identifying and investigating only vaccine breakthrough infections that result in hospitalization or death. The shift will help us maximize the quality of the data collected on cases of greatest clinical and public health importance. What that means, again, in English, is that unlike with getting a positive COVID test with the high cycles, 40 and more, that will give you a false positive, what they're saying is we're not even going to look at tests showing people that have breakthrough infections unless they're hospitalized. So if that same standard, again, had been applied over the past year to anyone who had the COVID, it would have been unbelievably different. The entire thing would have been completely different.
Sounds to me like science is breaking through,
Yeah.
and somebody's going to pay attention to it. Frequently we hear certain things that happened in the 1950s, and I remember the 1950s rather clearly for personal reasons. It was a year I finished college, I got married, started medical school, and it was also a time that life was different. They keep talking about people who lived at that time. That was a silent generation. Nobody cared about anything. And there was a recent story I hear, but it isn't Neil, it's Niall Ferguson, who wrote about the 1950s. And I was fascinated. Oh, the 1950s was an interesting time. But his article here was to talk about a severe Asian flu outbreak under Eisenhower. And the whole thing is Eisenhower, nobody remembers that. That's not the identification. Even though I lived during that decade rather boldly, and that I remember, polio and things like this. But I don't remember this horrendous flu, and it was bad. It was a lot worse than what I have now. But I think you saw it, and I find it so fascinating. Well, what did he do? What did he do? And to me, it looks like he sent them to the beach.
Yeah.
And do you happen to have that picture of Coney Island?
You know, I confess that I've slipped my mind to
Well,
put
that's
it up.
okay. I never put you on the spot like that.
No, I know.
But,
I can't
But I
believe
tell you, we can describe it. Coney Island, in the midst of this, right at the peak of this, people were in Coney Island.
Tons of them.
It wasn't 1,000 or 2,000 or 3,000. It looked like many, many thousand. And yes, it was a tough time, and people did die from it. But the attitude, the article was interesting because those individuals who happened to be living through the 50s had a different attitude about risk. And it wasn't that no matter what's wrong, it's the government's responsibility. You know, I'm a victim, take care of me. I'm a victim of our virus. I'm a victim of whatever. I'm a victim. I lost my job because I didn't go to work. It's still you're a victim. So in that case, there was that didn't happen. You know, it was so bland that I don't remember. People say, well, you probably just weren't reading the newspapers. But you know, the thing of it is, we were very much aware of the polio problem that we had back then and the vaccines that came out in the 50s. But it's just a different time, and I think instead of that attitude, which people would say, that's horrible, we could have saved lives if we'd have done that, and yet here I'll bet you the consequence. Well, they didn't have a lockdown, so just automatically eliminate all the consequences of the lockdown, economically speaking and emotionally speaking and medically speaking, and we were saved that time. But what was preserved was this idea that we didn't have to become a victim and crawl to the government and beg and plead and to take care of us and do everything. I mean, that didn't cross our minds. I'm sure it did for some, but it really wasn't the issue like it is today. You know, it is a big deal. So where then the motivation comes? Well, if the government's in charge and there's not much to do, we got to find something to do. So we'll change the way we do the test. Instead of having 1,000 people that are positive, we're going to find 20,000 people with it, and boy, we can really do it. But then you get introduced to the notion, well, what is the purpose of the lockdown? Did it have any medical purpose? And quite frankly, I've come to the conclusion, essentially none. A few people probably went along with it, but it wasn't. It wasn't for that. I think it was for the accumulation of power and the teaching people that they better be dependent on the government. And that's why I fear and talk a whole lot about belittling of anything talking about a passport and a vaccine passport. I've mentioned once before that we ought to have that as the line in the sand, not to be willing to go along with that.
Well, the Niall Ferguson piece, and we found it in Zero Hedge, and you can find that Tony on the picture. I don't know how it slipped my mind, but
I'm sorry.
No. But the point he makes in it is very important because he said there are a lot of similarities between the 2020 COVID and the 1957 Asian flu, they called it back then. The significant number of excess deaths, they both had that. But in some ways, as you suggested, the 1957 one was a little worse because it hit young people a lot more.
Yeah, that's right.
We know from stats now, and in fact, we can look at that next clip. We know from statistics now, thankfully, that there are virtually, and this is Alex Berenson again, there are virtually no excess deaths last year among people under 65. That's a good thing. What few there were, which is 58 per 100,000, a lot of that was lockdown-related, drugs, suicides, etc. So virtually none, and we can actually even put that next one on because this is what the article looks like that we looked at. A lot of similarities, in some ways worse in 57, but here's what Niall Ferguson says. The policy response of Dwight Eisenhower could hardly have been more different than the response in 2020. He didn't declare a state of emergency. There were no lockdowns. And despite the first wave of teenage illnesses, no school closures. You're not going to believe this, Dr. Paul. 6 students simply stayed home, as they usually did. Work continued uninterrupted. Excuse me. Workplaces were open. The Eisenhower administration saw no need to borrow to the hilt. He asked for $2.5 million instead of the $4 trillion that we had today. And they also said no lockdowns. His own advisors concluded in August of 57, quote, "There is no practical advantage in the closing of schools or the curtailment of public gatherings as it relates to the spread of this disease." And thankfully he listened to that actual science. And yeah, it's tragic for the people who died then and now, but the responses are really astonishing, the differences.
And guess what? There was no call for impeachment.
Yeah,
They didn't want to impeach Eisenhower.
Believe it or not.
But there was something called impeachment. The far left was so excited about impeachment, they did it twice.
Yeah, double up.
And hopefully they learned the lesson that it made no sense whatsoever. I'm ready to go on to one other subject here.
If you are, COVID.
Let's see. How about the lockdowns? We have some statistics now about some states, and we've talked about a lot of these, and I think we've covered a lot of this. But the article, though, is getting this information out. States with the strictest lockdown ruined livelihoods without saving lives.
Yeah.
So it didn't do any good. But somebody probably made some money. We know the government grew in power and influence, and it helped set the stage for everybody. Can't wait till they get the vaccine, and right now, unfortunately, I had somebody the other day that suggested to me that he said, "I don't like vaccine. I don't want the vaccine, but a lot of people can take it and they don't get sick." But he said, "I'm sort of tempted to do it because my job really requires traveling," and they do this. And you know, I keep thinking, I made this point a few times before, is that in the Soviet system, was totally authoritarian. Where you worked, what you did, and what you ate was everything determined by the government. But if you didn't pay attention and didn't follow the rules, they didn't send a policeman to come and put handcuffs on you and haul you off to prison. What they did, when he died, you economic benefit. And isn't that what's going on now? This cancel business, they can make you lose your job and everything else. And I've decided that we should be more willing to use the word aggression with a company that's able to do that and really study this whole issue. So how much leeway do they have because they're a private company? I've said in the past, I don't see them quite like a private company, doing this. And besides, this whole thing of cancellation and the way they do it, and there's evidence now that if the businessman doesn't go along, it may affect his credit rating and his ability to get a bailout and his ability to work the Federal Reserve. So there's more to it. So I see this whole thing. How else could they get so many business people to be such jerks? Unless they think, the businessman would say, "Oh, if I don't do it, this is what's going to happen to me." So they have baseball team owners who destroy 90% of their customers and say you can't come in. There has to be something wrong with that unless there's some bigger incentive than that. And I don't think it's an incentive which I would consider, a morally correct incentive to help people. I think it has to do with the competition on who's going to control the money.
Yeah. Well, let's put up that the title of this article that we're talking about. It's that next clip. And this is lockdown states, strict lockdown states. They ruin livelihoods without saving lives. And here's a couple of little stats from that article. It's from the New York Post. It's an opinion piece, but it's got some important facts. The 5 states with the strictest lockdowns over the last year, Hawaii, California, Massachusetts, New Jersey, and New York, have an average unemployment rate of 8.06%. In the 5 states with the lightest restriction, unemployment sits at just 3.48%, which is even lower than the national average of 3.5% unemployment. You'd say, okay, well, that's kind of a bummer. People lost their jobs, but you're going to put people's jobs over lives. They save so many lives. Well, here's from the same article. According to Worldometer, which is what we use and what really the industry standard for measuring these things said, the strictest lockdown states had COVID mortality of 1,423 per million. The laxest states had 1,449 per million. Really statistically identical. So the fact is they didn't save lives, they didn't do anything, and they destroyed people's livelihoods, they destroyed their happiness, they took a year away from them. And in this same article, he cites several new studies that say the same thing. A new study at the University of Chicago, we do not find detectable effects of shelter-in-place policies on disease spread or death. A MedRx study claimed benefits of lockdown appear grossly exaggerated. A peer-reviewed study by European epidemiologists in the journal Frontiers of Public Health, quote, stringency of the measures settled to fight pandemia, including lockdown, do not appear to be linked with death rates. So now we're starting to get actual peer-reviewed studies saying what we've been saying for quite a long time, which is they have not done any good.
Truth eventually wins out, but sometimes slowly and in a frustrating fashion.
Yes.
Okay, I had another little point I would like to make, and that has this comes from Breitbart, and about 2 weeks ago or so, we read about how bad a person Giuliani was and is.
We thought he was such a
Of course,
nice guy.
I perked up my eye. Oh yeah, I did have a little run-in with him one time. Maybe he is a bad guy. But it turns out that, it was really bad what they were charging him with. And then we had 3 papers, the Washington Post, New York Times, NBC, had this story out, that he had been told about this and knew about it, and he's being investigated by the FBI, and it's sort of, where there's smoke, must be something. So maybe Giuliani is actually guilty of this. But it turns out, this weekend, they came up with the information that there's a retraction.
Yeah.
And that has to be significant. I mean, these clowns who run these things and their only goal is not truth.
Yeah.
Why did they do this? So they've retracted the story of Giuliani because it was called a smear. And it may be, I hope what it is the recognition that, truth is not completely dead, and as bad as the judicial system is, and maybe even these people realize that if it was blatantly a smear and had no evidence for it, maybe they all of a sudden said, we could get sued for this.
Yeah.
Maybe the attorney came in, he might not have been a sympathizer as much as an honest person if he's advised them, say, you guys better watch out. And then all of a sudden, there's this removal. That is one thing. That would be good news if that's what's happened.
Yeah, they say when you call it fake news, you're just acting like a Trumper, but this is fake news. All of the 3, the New York Times, the Washington Post, and NBC News, claim that not only Giuliani, but also the One America News Network, I think it is, it's kind of a right-wing, pro-Trump news network, both of them received defensive briefings from the FBI saying that the Russians were trying to use them as propagandists, they were trying to influence them, and they ignored it. They both ignored it. And they, hours and hours on MSNBC talking about, this tells us the truth about Giuliani. He's really in with the Russians. That's why he's doing it. Same with OANN. It's not because they're challenging our fake news. It's because they're doing the bidding of Putin. Well, they all 3 had to over the weekend had to say, you know what, we have to correct this because it's not true. The question is, how did you do this in the first place? If it was independent media that did this, they'd be banned from Twitter. They'd be banned from Facebook. You're publishing lies. You're banned. They can do it over and over and over, and there are no consequences. But the other thing, Dr. Paul, is Senator Ron Johnson from Wisconsin, Republican from Wisconsin, they also claimed that he had received defensive briefings from the FBI, and he ignored them. And I was in the gym, believe it or not, on Friday, and I was on the treadmill, and stupidly, I got the treadmill underneath MSNBC, which I guess it made me run faster because I was just so annoyed. But literally the whole time I was there, they had expert after expert, FBI, former FBI people, going on about, well, how is it possible that Senator Johnson ignored these warnings from the FBI that the Russians are after him? Maybe he's in on it, and over, endlessly. Well, here's what happened with Johnson. He said, yeah, I got a defensive briefing from the FBI about Russians. I think he's the secretary of the Homeland Security Committee. But listen to this, I clipped this, and it's a little bit long, but I clipped it because it reminds me of what you've always said about these briefings. He said, here's Johnson, Senator Johnson. Regarding reports I received an FBI briefing warning me that I was a target of Russian disinformation, I can confirm that I received such a briefing in August of 2020. I asked the briefers what specific evidence they had regarding this warning, and they could not provide me with anything other than generalized warning. Without specific information, I felt the briefing was completely useless and unnecessary, since I was fully aware of the dangers of Russian disinformation. Because there was no substance to the briefing, and because it followed the production and leaking of a false intelligence product by the Democrat leaders, I suspected from the briefing it was being given to be used at some future date for the purpose that it is now being used, to offer the biased media an opportunity to falsely accuse me of being a tool of Russia despite warnings.
Right. You know, one thing that I have observed has happened these last couple of years, which I didn't assume was a routine, and maybe it has been used before, but it's more routine than ever before, and that is during Russiagate. Let's assume, which I assume is correct, is that Russiagate was a corrupted challenge to Trump and others, and they blame them. But they blame Trump for the things that they were doing. If they, you know, Hillary and all this, they were in business with these guys.
Yeah.
And so they take this and flip it over and charge and charge and charge, and then put the people who are innocent on the defensive for crimes that these guys were doing. But in a way, I think that's what's going on now with Biden wants to investigate Ukraine. He wants to find out how Trump was involved with Ukraine. and yet think of the evidence that was available before the election of the Biden clan, how they had been in business in Ukraine, and now all of a sudden, you know, they sure don't. You'd think, well, this good, everything, all the truth will come out. No, the truth is going to come out. You're going to bury anything about what Biden did in Ukraine and his son, and they're going to put all the blame on. They'll try and bring it up and say, well, we'll make Trump defend himself and why he didn't make $10 billion by dealing with Ukraine.
Yeah.
So it's almost the way these briefings go. If they're coming and they're telling you something, you almost have to say it's propaganda, and the opposite is true. And some of these charges, and that's what this article was all about, you know, because the opposite was true, but they got caught. You'd still wonder whether they think there's magic. They have all this control over everything and everybody, or they're really stupid.
Yeah.
And maybe a little bit of each. One thing is, I think it comes out as looking like they're very immoral.
Yeah, that's a shocker. Well, I'm going to finish up two quickies. First of all, hypocrisy watch. Let's put on this next clip. Secretary of State Antony Blinken. Yes, let's go, the next one. Secretary of State Antony Blinken. Today, on World Press Freedom Day, the United States continues to advocate for press freedom, the safety of journalists worldwide, and access to information on and offline. A free and independent press ensures the public has access to information. Knowledge is power. Well, Dr. Paul, a picture says 1,000 words. So let's look at the next clip with this in mind. Julian Assange. That's all you need to say when you read what Blinken says. So really disgusting. But I'm not going to leave it there because we have to end on a good news story. That's the rule around here, I think. So let's look at the next one. This is a good news story. And this is put up by Ian Smith. He's the guy who runs this fitness center that refused to close down. This is a great story. Hundreds of parents in Vail, Arizona attended a school board meeting protesting mask mandates for schools. They would not leave. The board was overwhelmed and outnumbered. They quit. The parents elected new members and immediately struck down mask mandates for kids. This is the way. That is the way, Dr. Paul.
Right. Now, the one question I haven't answered for my satisfaction on what you've just reported is what is really behind this motivation of the school board and the people who preach this and move it along. You keep thinking, have they been misled by the propaganda? Probably.
Yeah.
Are they part of a conspiracy to turn the country upside down and deliver it to the cultural Marxists? Maybe there's a few in higher places that would like to do that. But the motivation sort of is fascinating because I think that we always should look for motivation. I often think about, the discussion after 9/11 was, when a murder is committed, no matter when or where or what, I imagine the press within minutes. Who did it and why? Who did it and why? What was the motivation? Somebody has to have a motivation. And I can remember getting into a little bit of political trouble. I didn't get kicked out of Congress and I didn't get canceled, sort of. But I said, what is the motivation? Are we allowed to ask the motivation for 9/11? And that was the greatest political sin, according to many in Washington and elsewhere, that you don't ask the motivation. But I also understand the emotions involved too, because believe me, being in Washington during that period of time, it was an emotional event, and there was a very strong desire to take care of the people who were willing to use those tactics. But motivations are very important, and I think that's what's going on right now is the motivation of these people who are determined to continue the lockdowns and also branching over to the canceling of people and supporting Black Lives Matter and all this radical stuff. It's a real problem. But I think it shouldn't be that complicated. I think that the message for liberty is not complex, because all we have to think about is, in a truly moral society, is one that people don't commit aggression against somebody else. And I like to read history of that, and I find out that there's some basic principles that I've just stated are in the Hammurabi Code before the Ten Commandments were written, that you didn't kill people. And there were some basic human factors there. It's just that there's a human nature among many people that come and go that are always using violence. And just think about the nonsense going on and all these false accusations. That should be described as violence. Yes, we're having lockdown to help people. They're always motivated by humanitarianism and compassion to take care of people. That's fake. And if you don't say that too loud, because it might get you into trouble, then they might come and ask me a few questions. And anyway, I think that we live in interesting times. And Daniel has reported on these positive things, and I think that is the case. I think the people are shifting. I have always been challenged, because so many people who have come to some of my speeches say, how can you be optimistic? How do you remain optimistic? And because I look at the people who are ideologically influential, and I also look at the fact that you don't have to have majorities or a large number of people endorsing certain ideas. You need people who have endorses the ideas of nonviolence and being in important places. But right now, unfortunately, what we're seeing is an epidemic of individuals who happen to reject the notion of nonviolence, and they use it, and that's why you see all the lying and the scheming and the fake news and everything turning into money and all. It's going to be easier when we run out of money and we're all broke and we have to get together. Then the challenge will be there. It's either going to be total totalitarianism, or we're going to wake up like that group in Arizona and said, enough is enough. Gone. You're gone. We don't want you as our school board member. We want to live in a freer society. So that's what we're going to be fighting for. And that is why we have this program called the Ron Paul Institute for Peace and Prosperity. I want to thank everybody for tuning in today to the Liberty Report. Please come back soon.